One of his projects as a legislator was we've got to do something to preserve the Indian Native American heritage. So we encouraged the legislature to name many of the new counties that were coming in almost yearly and gave them Indian names. So we have many, many of the counties in Michigan that were like Leelanau, Oscoda, Tuscola, now Shiawassee was Indian, but that was by caste, Leelanau, Keweenaw. All those counties with their Indian names were due to Schoolcraft's influence in preserving this heritage. So as we travel around the state today, as I do, I think of that. And in your area, in Western Michigan, both the Schoolcraft town was named for him. Most of the other counties in that were named after national figures. I noticed Van Buren and the others,
Calhoun,
Calhoun and Cass and the like. But in the northern part of the state, we see the influence.
We have a Schoolcraft County in the UP.
That's right.
And in Schoolcraft Village in my district, we don't, is there any evidence that he was ever there or passed through?
I doubt it, because he was mostly, except for his brief visits to Detroit, to attend the legislature in Detroit en route to the East Coast, he was mostly in the northern part of Michigan, at Mackinac Island, the Sioux, and in the Apostle Islands and the western part of Lake Superior. So, but he would have known about it because this was the period in the 1820s when he was here that the western part of the state was opened up. And after all, Kalamazoo was on one of the main travel routes to Chicago. So he certainly would have been aware of the Battle Creek, Jackson, Kalamazoo. But there's no evidence that I found that he actually visited there.
Well, can you say, Phil, if he would have had a role, and I assume he probably would have in his position, but in negotiating some of the treaties as well? Because I know it was during Cass's governorship that many of the treaties with the Native Americans were consummated, and I'm guessing that Schoolcraft must have been involved in that.
He was involved in a lot of them. In 1826, in the Treaty of Prairie du Chien, he attended and supervised it. The major treaty was the Treaty of Washington in 1846, and this had to do with the cession of all the land north of a line from Grand Rapids to Port Huron to the area in the Upper Peninsula east of the Chocolate River. At that time, there were 2,900 Native Americans living in that area, in their villages along.
A huge expanse of land.
Yes. And he supervised that treaty, which was held on Mackinac Island. And he represented the federal government in these negotiations. And his contacts, again, with the Indians, the trust they had in him, facilitated the completion of that treaty, which provided basically that the Indians living along the lakeshore of Michigan and others would be removed. This was the American policy of removal at the time, a belief in part inspired by humanitarian reasons, that the Indians would go westward, west to the Mississippi in Indian country, in Kansas and Iowa, and then learn agriculture and the like. It didn't work. Many of the tribes from Michigan went out and discovered there were no trees. And they were a woodland culture. And they weren't happy there. Many came back. Many never left, and they stayed in reservations along Lake Michigan. So it became quite a controversial treaty later in this century, or at least in the 1970s, over the Indian fishing and hunting rights.
What happened to Henry Schoolcraft once he left Michigan then and his time was up here?
Well, he went back to New York for a few years, and he did a book in 1846 on the Iroquois in an area where he grew up himself as a child. And he moved to Washington. His first wife, Jane, died, and he remarried a woman from South Carolina, Mary Howard, and they moved and lived in Washington, D.C. And he continued his research, and in that large 6-volume work that we referred to, he did the research and published it. And he was called on by the government on a variety of projects, and he died in 1864. And eventually, his papers, voluminous papers, were first turned over to the Smithsonian, and then they, in turn, after culling what they wanted and destroying the integrity of the collection, in 1917 and 1942, as I recall, Smithsonian turned the Schoolcraft papers over to the Library of Congress, and that's where they are now.
Well, Phil, thank you very much for being on my program. We're almost out of time, but just to kind of recap a little bit, we've been talking about Henry Rose Schoolcraft,
Yes.
who was a very important figure in Michigan's territorial time and then early statehood, with researching and recording and preserving for us the life and times of Michigan's Aboriginal peoples. And Wayne State University Press and others are republishing some of his works, and you can find those. I'm sure Wayne State Press has a website.
Michigan State, I should say.
And Michigan State Press is publishing these.
Yes.
Okay, and they have websites, and those books could be ordered through them, and it's a real treasure and reflection of Michigan's past.
Yes.
Thanks for being on my program, Phil.
It's a pleasure.
And thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week on Current Events.